Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I did a video yesterday discussing partials again. And invariably, when this topic comes up, it seems like these days people always bring up this exact same question every time, and that's, but Jason, isn't the deadlift a partial exercise? So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this, because the answer to that is yes, the deadlift is a partial exercise. Now, is it an extreme partial like we think of people doing third reps, quarter reps, things like that? No. But is it a partial exercise? Yeah, absolutely. It is not full range of motion for really any of the joints involved for the most part, other than some of the erectors in the back, right? Because they're only meant to really move so far under load. So the answer is yes. And when I say the deadlift, we're talking about the conventional deadlift. Kind of one of my pet peeves is that when we mention basic exercises, people ask what variation. Deadlift means conventional deadlift unless you're talking about some other type of deadlift, in which case you throw that name in. You know, when someone says the press, that has an exact meaning. They're not talking about anything other than standing, doing a strict press off your chest and pressing it overhead with a barbell. If it's some other variation, that full variation name will be in there. So when we say the deadlift, we mean the conventional barbell deadlift, right? But yeah, even most of the variations are still partials. So yes, it's a partial exercise. So hypothetically speaking, that means it has a little bit less hypertrophic potential. All right, because when we're talking about partial exercises, when you trim a few inches out of the range of motion on a lift, you can still gain a lot of muscle doing that. It's just that the potential, the total potential for muscle is smaller. Now, when you start cutting down to much, much shorter, when we start going to half reps and less, then we see an enormous difference, right? When you start doing half reps and quarter reps on big exercises, most studies confirm that you will gain a dramatically smaller amount of muscle, even if you sometimes double the amount of weight on the bar. That's been confirmed repeatedly. But the interesting thing is that even though the deadlift is a partial, it's not that extreme of a partial. And the problem we have there is that people will then use that, and this is again the problem. People will say, well, the deadlift is already a partial, so what's the problem with making it an even smaller partial? Well, because the more and more of a partial you make it, and the shorter you trim down the range of motion, the less muscle activation you're going to get no matter how heavy you go, even if you do a 1 rep max with your half range of motion, right? Even if you're a 500-pound deadlifter and you can do 900 pounds for a half rep, you're going to get less total muscle activation as a result because you're just using leverage advantages and doing it easier work. It's just easier. And there's certain points in there where you're putting less total tension on the muscles, even when you're lifting your 100% 1 rep max, right? And that's what people need to understand. But because of that, that doesn't mean that it's not an effective exercise, because we also have things that we think of as effective range of motion. And you can still gain a pretty good amount of muscle on the deadlift, and you obviously gain a lot of strength. But what people also need to remember, the deadlift is always going to be kind of a supplemental exercise. And I know it's a primary exercise, and it's a competitive lift in more than one strength sport. Now in like 3 different strength sports at this point. But the problem is that it's still a partial, right? So therefore, and it's kind of hard to recover from. So most people are not going to do large amounts of volumes of deadlifting. And when you do, if you're going to do a lot of deadlifting, you have to very carefully structure your program around that. So actually most lifters in a way still treat the deadlift in their programming like a secondary exercise. They really do from a volume and programming perspective. The majority do. Not everyone, but the majority, including oftentimes competitive lifters. So what we're dealing with is oftentimes secondary stress. Most of these guys are doing squatting and some sort of other back work, which, again, that will handle most of the hypertrophy, and the deadlift might be just shoring up weak links and getting the specificity of training. But the fact is, there are certain muscles in the deadlift that we do see pretty close to maximum muscle activation in, irrespective of that, at least on EMGs, things like the latissimus dorsi, which is always interesting. You know, you'll get a lot of people in the bodybuilding world who will say, no, it doesn't even work the lats that well. Well, the EMG studies show it lights the lats up just as well, oftentimes, as rowing and pull-ups and things in some cases. So yeah, it actually does do a pretty good job on the lats. Things like the spinal erectors, stabilizer muscles, muscles that aren't necessarily intended to move so much, things like certain parts of your core and everything. Yeah, it lights those up pretty good, pretty decent in the hamstrings. Definitely the glutes. So glutes are definitely high on the activation list. Now, obviously, muscles like the quads, right? Muscles like the quads, and even to some a lesser extent the hamstrings. Maybe not so much. You know, you're not going to grow massive legs doing deadlifts. You build a pretty solid back. In fact, you could deadlift only and get there, but you're going to have to do a lot of volume to do that. That's kind of the difference there with the deadlift. There are a lot of guys who are really strong on the deadlift who aren't that big, who maybe they don't always do that much training volume, or they have really good leverages. If you got really long arms, you're really cutting down the range of motion, and therefore the hypertrophic potential is less. But the point we come to with that is, just because the exercise is a bit of a partial, do not use that as an excuse to start cutting the range of motion even shorter. It's like, well, I'm already part of the way there, I might as well just finish it up and make it a useless exercise. No, you don't want to do that. But here's what I always advocate, and this is what a lot of people out there advocate, a lot of experts out there advocate. And again, Dr. Mike, perfect example. If your goal is to maximize hypertrophy and you want to use a deadlift as a variation, then yeah, you probably do need to increase the range of motion. In other words, if you're trying to do some sort of high volume phase of your training to bulk up, to get bigger, because we're not always trying to maximize hypertrophy all the time. We're not always trying to do that all the time. And you want to do a deadlift variation to do that, yeah, you probably do need to add range of motion. And that's what I'll tell a lot of guys. If you're in a higher volume phase of your training and you're not training the deadlift to get as strong as possible on the deadlift in that phase, or you're not just working technique on the deadlift, then a deficit deadlift or a snatch grip deadlift will get the job done. And there's been some misconception. I get a lot of people out there who are like, oh, doesn't the snatch grip deadlift, due to the arm position, work certain parts of the upper back better? No, it's not the arm position. People get that confused. Yeah, snatch grip high pull is different because there's actual movement of the shoulders and scapula and everything. There's movement happening. That's different because of those angles. With the deadlift, that's just not the case. It's because you're creating a deficit. A snatch grip deadlift, your torso is having to come lower to the ground. It's like creating a pretty large deficit on your deadlift. So you're increasing range of motion. That's why it works better. It's not because of the actual grip. I've actually heard someone try to recommend, oh, well, snatch grip rack pulls, and it's like, oh my God. At this point, people should understand why that's ridiculous. That's basically like doing rack pulls standing on plates. You know, it's like do one thing to reduce the range of motion and another thing to increase it back up so that it's just like a deadlift. You know, you just do a deadlift off the floor at that point. Probably be better. But yeah, snatch grip rack pulls. No, guys, the snatch grip is because it creates a deficit without having to put plates and stuff underneath you. Forces you to use a lighter weight, but we increase the range of motion. So yeah, you do have a little more potential for hypertrophy when you're doing a higher volume training oftentimes. But people need to remember, the deadlift is not such a short partial that it doesn't have potential for good hypertrophy. It's just the point we would make is that if you were trying to maximize muscle stimulation, to maximize muscle growth, creating a deficit to increase the range of motion can become a valuable tool there. But remember, again, this point needs to be reiterated. Just because the deadlift doesn't have a maximum range of motion on different muscles doesn't mean that you won't have problems by reducing it further. You're going to get less muscle activation if you start reducing your deadlift range of motion further, and people need to remember that. Don't use that as an excuse to basically do a rack pull. That's not a good justification for it, because you're taking already something that is a negative against the exercise for muscle stimulation and saying, well, since it's got a little bit of a negative there, a little bit of a bad thing that's not ideal, let's just make it 5 times worse. Again, terrible logic, and you do see that happen a lot. But the reality is, yeah, it is a bit of a partial exercise, and there are going to be phases to where if you're trying to use a deadlift to maximize hypertrophy, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and increase that range of motion a little bit. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.